Hey there, guys. This is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review for the Christmas season. I hope you guys have been having a good December so far. Today's Christmas comedy I'm going to be reviewing is the 1983 movie Trading Places, starring Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. So, yeah, and this is a movie that for a while I had heard good things about, but until recently I didn't get around to watching it because it was never free on any streaming service, but it recently came to Tubi for free, so I figured since it's Christmas season and it's a Christmas movie, might as well give this movie a watch. And overall, thought it was a rather well done movie. But anyways, what is the plot to this movie for those who don't know? Well, the plot of this comedy is as follows. A down and out con artist trades lifestyles with a well-to-do investor as part of a bet between an odd pair of cold-hearted millionaires. So that's basically the plot synopsis to the movie. And this movie, I do consider it as a Christmas movie because it does take place on Christmas and there are Christmas themes in this movie, but, you know, that's just me. And anyways, how was this movie received? Well, when this movie was released in the U.S. on June 8th of 1983, it received positive reviews from critics and audiences, and it was a good hit at the box office. It was a big hit at the box office, and it only catapulted Eddie Murphy's career even farther into superstardom because before this movie came out, really the only movie Eddie Murphy was known for was the 1982 comedy movie 48 Hours with him and Nick Nolte, which was the very first movie he starred in, and 48 Hours was a huge hit. And I watched that for the first time this year. That was a really good comedy movie. Now, I would say I do like 48 Hours a little more than this movie, but I still thought that this was a rather well-done movie at the end of the day. And of course, because of the success that John Landis had directing this movie, he was able to work with Eddie Murphy again on the 1988 comedy movie Coming to America, which I absolutely love that movie. Now, I heard they made a sequel to that movie, but heard the sequel was garbage, but we're not here to talk about that. Again, whole nother topic, whole nother video, whole nother day. And one thing I will say, this movie's got a really good cast. You got Eddie Murphy, you got Dan Aykroyd, you got Jamie Lee Curtis, you got Paul Gleason, you know, just really good cast of actors in this movie. And so without further ado, let's get into my reviews. So the movie starts off where we are introduced to Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine. So the movie starts off where we are introduced to a character of the movie by the name of Louis Winthrop III, played by Dan Aykroyd, who I really like Dan Aykroyd as an actor. You know, after this movie, he would star in the first two Ghostbusters movies from the 1980s, absolute comedy classics. But you have him in here, so that's nice. But basically, in this movie, the character Louis Winthrop III, played by Dan Aykroyd, is basically this rich millionaire who basically, you know, attends a business and stuff like that. And, you know, and we're basically introduced to him early on in the movie where he's in bed and, you know, the guy in charge, you know, his butler basically, you know, gets him breakfast in bed and stuff like that. And he's on his way to work. And not long after that, Eddie Murphy, he doesn't show up right away in the movie. It takes about 9 minutes before he's introduced in the movie, but when he's introduced in this movie, he's absolutely hilarious. And Eddie Murphy's character in this movie, now Eddie Murphy plays a character in this movie by the name of Billy Ray Valentine, and I thought he was really funny in this movie, you know, especially when we're first introduced to him, where Billy Ray Valentine is or Eddie Murphy's character is basically, you know, he basically has, I don't know how to describe it, kind of like a little mini cart, but it's like, you guys know what I'm talking about. It's like the mini carts where it's like, you can hold it because it has two handles on the side, but there's four wheels, and it's like one of those small things at the bottom. You know what I'm talking about, but basically his character uses one of that, and he's like, thank you very much. And of course, he's pretending to be blind, you know, because Eddie Murphy's rather funny in this movie. He's like, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, hey, how are you doing? And then I love the part when the guy says to him, "I have no money to give you," and then he literally pleads, "Please, anything, a quarter." But just like that scene is funny, but here's the thing. The whole reason that entire scene is funny is because Eddie Murphy's line delivery and execution is what makes it really work. And then I love the part when Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, says, "How do you like a stump up your ass?" That part was funny. And then one of the guys says to him, "You stay out of here." And then Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, he just brushes off what the guy says. He brushes off what the guy said to him, and he says, "You got a lot of soul. I appreciate it." Like, that scene right there is funny. And at about the 14-minute mark of the movie, and then of course there's the whole scene where the cops basically go up to Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, who's pretending to be blind, and Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, says, "Who's that? Who's there? What do you want?" And the guys say, "Police. We've had some complaints about con men pretending to be blind and crippled." And then I love the excuse that Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, comes up with. He's like, "Oh, I wasn't pretending." He says, "Look, I would like to help, but I haven't been able to walk since I stepped on that landmine on Vietnam in 72. And the cops are like, "Oh, we were in Vietnam too." And he was like, "Where were you at?" And then, I love the part after that when, after this whole conversation, they take off the glasses off Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine. And then he stands up, and then I love the part when Billy Ray Valentine says, "It's a miracle, I can see." And then he yells at the top of his lungs, "It's a miracle, I can see and I can stand. Thank you, God." And then he basically runs away, and the cops just stare at him. Like, I thought that part was funny. And then not long after that, Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, just so happens to accidentally run into Louis Winthrop III, played by Dan Aykroyd, where basically they run into each other by mistake, and Louis Winthrop and Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, picks up the suitcase, because he's going to give it back to him. However, Dan Aykroyd's character, Louis Winthrop, accuses him of trying to steal it and stuff like that. And then, basically, Dan Aykroyd's character, Louis, yells at the top of his lungs, "Police," as he saw the police, and then the police decide to chase after Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, who runs inside the house. And then there's a very funny scene where, no joke, you literally have 10 police officers running inside the house, and Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, is trying to get away from them, and he basically runs inside the house and goes underneath the table. And then I love the part when they're basically pointing a bunch of guns at him. And then I love the part when the police officers point the gun at him, and he says, "How may I help you, officers?" He says, "Is there a problem, officers?" And then they're pointing the guns at him as he's smiling. I thought that part was funny. And then, of course, Eddie Murphy's character, Billy, gets arrested and he goes to jail. And we then lead to a scene 25 minutes into the movie. This is by far my favorite scene of the movie, where Billy, which is Eddie Murphy's character, is in a jail cell, and he is pretending to be Bruce Lee because basically he's in a jail cell with a few people, and they're basically asking him some questions and stuff like that. And then one of the guys is like, "Hold up a second, your story doesn't add up." And Eddie Murphy's character says, Billy says, "I did not have a knife on me." And the guy's like, "Wait a minute, you told me yesterday you cut a guy." And then I love the excuse that Eddie Murphy's character, Billy, comes up with, where Billy Ray Valentine says, "Oh, that's because I cut him with my fingers." And then I absolutely love the part when Billy Ray Valentine, played by Eddie Murphy, says, "Bruce Lee was my instructor," and Eddie Murphy's pretending to be Bruce Lee. Like, I thought that scene was absolutely hilarious, and he upsets two large guys in front of him, and then they pin him against a jail cell, and then I thought that scene was really funny. And then, of course, Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, is let go, and then The reason he's let go is because these people, the Duke brothers, basically paid to get him out of jail, and basically Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, now owns a house because he's now a millionaire, apparently. And, you know, which I thought was a rather interesting plot scheme. And our main character of the movie, Louis Winthrop III, who is a millionaire played by Dan Aykroyd, he gets framed for a crime that he did not do. But, you know, a little earlier on in the movie, basically, there's a whole conversation bit where the Duke brothers basically say that they're basically going to frame... Basically, long story short, basically the Duke brothers make a bet that they can find a way to screw over Louis's life. That way he'll end up, you know, on the streets and stuff like that without a job. And, you know, they succeeded in that part. And, you know, there's also a lot of other good stuff in this movie too, you know, like, for instance, you know, I love the whole part when Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, is getting a car ride with the Duke brothers, and there's a taxi driver in the front who's actually played by Richard Pryor, and I love the part when they basically tell Eddie Murphy's character Billy something, but he doesn't believe them, and he's like, "You're joking, right?" And the guy's like, "Nope." Like, that scene right there is funny because of the way Eddie Murphy is able to execute it, you know. And I also like Dan Aykroyd's character in this movie, Louis Winthrop. I thought that he was funny too. And there's also some other funny scenes in this movie. Like, for example, now remember how I said that Eddie Murphy's character, remember how I said his character, Billy Ray Valentine, was in jail? Well, as I said, when he was in jail, there were these two large guys who pinned him against the jail cell. Well, they just so happened to come across Eddie Murphy's character, Billy, when he's at a bar that night with some women, and he basically says, "That's my cab," and stuff like that. So he's able to get the bad guys to not basically beat him up at the bar. And Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine's like, "Look, I gotta go," and stuff like that, but if you want, there's more than enough room for you women to come into my limousine and go to my house and have a party and stuff like that, which they agreed to. But eventually the party ends, you know. And this does not happen until later in the movie. But anyways, let's get back to Dan Aykroyd's character, Louis Winthrop. Remember how I said he was basically framed for a crime he didn't do? Well, because of that, the bank basically cuts up his credit card, so he doesn't really have anywhere he can go now and stuff like that. But Ophelia, a character played by Jamie Lee Curtis in this movie, is, you know, she decides to bring him to his house in a taxi cab and stuff like that. And again, I thought that this movie had a really good cast, you know. I thought that the three main stars, Jamie Lee Curtis, Dan Aykroyd, and Eddie Murphy, all worked really well together in this movie. And eventually, at about the 1 hour and 19-minute mark of the movie, Billy Ray Valentine, Eddie Murphy's character, is basically listening to a secret conversation that the Duke brothers were responsible for basically framing Louis for a crime that he didn't do and stuff like that, and that they're gonna basically screw both of them over. So obviously they want revenge. And at the end of the movie, of course, Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, and Dan Aykroyd's character, Louis Winthrop, are able to win a bet that they make, and they are able to overthrow the bad guys. And basically, the bad guys are about $396 million in debt and stuff like that. And but then, you know, how they're able to do this is, you know, basically when they pull this off, like, they're basically telling people to come up for some money and stuff like that, basically checks and stuff, and Dan Aykroyd's character, Louis Winthrop, and Eddie Murphy's character, Billy Ray Valentine, they managed to basically, you know, get a bunch of people's attention and stuff like that, and near the end of the movie, the bad guys lose their $396 million in debt, and they end up losing everything as karma for trying to ruin the two main characters' lives. And then the movie ends where Ophelia, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, Louis Winthrop, played by Dan Aykroyd, and Billy Ray Valentine, played by Eddie Murphy, are all happy and the problem's been resolved. So yeah, at the end of the day, I thought that this was a rather well done comedy, and I would definitely recommend checking this out for the Christmas season if you haven't. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give Trading Places a 9 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching my review, and we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.